what a card he is, Donald Trump. He might not take the threat of Russian interference in our elections very seriously, but a 67-page report from the Senate Intel Committee shows that there is nothing funny about it. The bipartisan report, released just one day after Robert Mueller warned of the gravity of the threat, finds that election systems in all 50 of these United States were targeted. The report states, quote, the Russian government directed extensive activity beginning in at least 2014 and carrying into at least 2017 against U.S. election infrastructure at the state and local level. The report found that the Russians took advantage of the nation's decentralized voting system, quote, exploiting seams, that's exploiting, not exploding, those seams between the federal oversight and state election systems. It also found that election cybersecurity was, quote, sorely lacking in 2016, and that federal attempts to warn states about potential security breaches, quote, did not provide enough information or go to the appropriate people. Joining me here at the table, senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and former FBI special agent Clint Watson, a man who saw this stuff coming in real time before almost anyone, and we're going to talk about that in a second. I want to ask you, it's a great place to start because you were so prescient about this back in 2016 and have followed it as closely as literally any human I know. What did you learn from the Senate Intel report?
There were two parts of it that I thought haven't been talked about, really. One, that Russia was trying to deploy election monitors or people to monitor polling places, which was our fear on election night. It wasn't who was going to win, but would someone show up with a weapon at a polling place thinking the election had been stolen? That was my number one fear. What were the Russians doing there? What were these monitors doing there? Were they going to start a provocation? Were they going to claim that there was some sort of election rigging or voter fraud? They were amplifying that. The other part was the Associated Press being a central point, essentially, for the results of the election. So could the Russians actually hack into there, change the votes in between the actual voting systems and the media such that a false report comes out, which would then create mass confusion and lead everybody to believe there's election rigging? So those two things I thought were remarkable and have really kind of gone under the table up to this point.
Kimberly Atkins, I want to just toss this to you because it's one of my obsessive things. Back in 2016, I remember talking to people like Clint and others and said this second thing, you forget about whether the votes can be manipulated, whether the voting systems can be hacked. We got a lot to worry about there. But here's an easy point of entry. On the night of the election, the results start to come in. The Secretary of State of Vermont sends its report to the Associated Press, and suddenly there's an announcement that Donald Trump has won Vermont, one of the most democratic states in the country, 92-8. And you've got the networks going on television saying Donald Trump apparently has won an overwhelming landslide victory in Vermont. And everyone says that's not right. That's not real. And all of a sudden you have chaos, not because the votes have been altered, but because the reporting of the votes has been altered. And that is a soft target. Can you imagine what would happen there? And why are we not more focusing on it more? And do you think the Senate report will get us to focus on it more?
Yeah, I mean, that is a very real concern. It was a concern in 2016, because if you also remember at that time, Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, had already begun this messaging that if he loses, that means that the vote is rigged in some way, that there is something nefarious going on. So he was already planting the seeds in his own campaign messaging, which had some folks concerned that there would be an effort to try to deny the legitimacy of the vote. He ended up winning, and so that didn't happen, but it could happen again in 2020. There are a lot of soft spots in the election system. We focus a lot on the Senate Intelligence Committee, importantly so, but one of the things that goes on in the background on Capitol Hill all the time is there have been lots of hearings where lots of local and state people have come in and have literally begged Congress to act in order to give them the tools that they need to secure up their election systems before the election, and Congress has not acted.
I want to read this. I want to read this thing from the Washington Post here that talks about the Senate Intelligence Report. The headline is new Senate Intel Report deepens the mysteries surrounding Russian 2016 election interference. A James Hohmann piece. It says, quote, "But the biggest fear at the highest levels of the intelligence world expressed during multiple interviews that are quoted in the report is that Russian military officers were studying the decentralized election systems in the United States to identify the weakest links in preparation for something much more malicious and chaotic in 2020. So I ask you, Gabe, as you think about this, you think about, we've heard Bob Mueller in the hearing. They're doing it now. They're going to keep doing it. We've seen Christopher Wray in multiple public settings say, dude, like my hair's on fire. This is a 5-alarm fire. we're going to talk in a second about Moscow Mitch, but I just ask you this from what you know, and you talk to political players all the time. How worried are they, and how worried should they be?
The answer to the second question is extremely worried, more worried about this than maybe anything else when it comes to the actual election day in 2020. They're all very worried about this right now, particularly Democrats talk about this a lot. The answer, though, is that they don't really know how to be worried about it because there's no obvious recourse for them to do anything here. You do have people at the state and local levels constantly asking for money, constantly asking for new policies to be put in place and for new oversight, but that's just not happening. And when you look at what's happening in the Senate, particularly with Senate Republicans, as I know we'll talk about, shutting down new election security measures, you have Democrats in particular, but political players of all stripes essentially saying, this is terrible, but we don't know what to do.
I want to turn to the Senate. I'm going to get to you right now because I know you're going to have a lot to say about this, Rev, but I want to turn to that very question now and what Republicans did this week in the face of all of this report and what Mueller said and everything else we know. The reality that despite all of that, you've got Mitch McConnell shutting down a vote on election security measures, two of them. It prompted, it's one of the most astonishing things I've seen, most irresponsible. It's not the first time that McConnell's done something like this. And I want to play a little clip of my friend Joe Scarborough on Morning Joe this morning when he applied the new moniker that I think should apply to Mitch McConnell forever after. Let's play that right now.
He is aiding and abetting Vladimir Putin's ongoing attempts to subvert American democracy, according to the Republican FBI, CIA, DNI, Intel Committee directors. All Republicans are all saying Russia is subverting American democracy, and Moscow Mitch won't even let the Senate take a vote on it. Joe. That is un-American.
Un-American?
Absolutely. When you look at the fact, you've got to look at the total context. Donald Trump, Mitch McConnell, and the Republicans had tried to convince the American public there was this massive voter fraud. They had people feeling that they were going to steal the election. They set the climate for what Russia could have, and in some cases actually did. So if you're going outside and people are walking by with an umbrella, even though it's not raining, you're getting ready for the rain because they took the umbrella out. They're the ones that raised the issue. Now they're the ones that's going to shut down, looking at any possibility of the fraud. They're the ones who wanted the vote ID laws, all of these requirements, and all of a sudden we don't want anything. And it happens to coincide with the Russian strategy. Some of us feel that that's a little bit too far. Clearly, they have set the table for Russians to continue to do what they want to do. And I think not only Democrats, but those of us in the civil rights and voting rights community are very concerned about it. When you have him talking about people at the polls trying to provoke something, all they need is one disturbance to overturn a whole precinct's vote.
Totally.
That's extremely dangerous.
I want to add, Kimberly Atkins, I want to read to you something from the Washington Post here, a column that was written by Frida Gaitis, and ask you about, what the motivation here is, because we've seen Republicans capitulate to Donald Trump, who previously did not like him, currently don't like him. But here's a thing that Ms. Gaitis wrote. Why are Republicans the party of flag huggers and fist pumping, a USA chants, throwing the gates open to America's foes? The answer is as clear as it is disturbing. That is what President Trump wants. And why does Trump want the country to lower its guard against a proven, ongoing assault by the Kremlin? Because Trump fully expects that Russian President Vladimir Putin's interference will help him win in 2020, just as it did in 2016. And I would say it's not just that he expects it, Kimberly, he's inviting it. We saw him on George Stephanopoulos basically saying, Russia, can you hear me? Come back, do it again. And now there are other countries we know he's kind of inviting to do it too by opening the door. So just there's a question in here somewhere, I promise you. But what is the deal here? Is Mitch McConnell fully in the back pocket of a totally bankrupt and corrupt Donald Trump?
Mitch McConnell, since Donald Trump has taken office, has taken the role of protecting this president at all costs. Having a Republican in the White House to McConnell is more important than anything else. We know, one, that from the moment he got into the White House and even before, Donald Trump didn't want to talk about doubt over the legitimacy of his presidency. And he was very concerned about that, and he wanted to downplay Russia completely. Then, as you pointed out, subsequently, we've seen that message sort of shift. There wasn't, I didn't do anything wrong, nothing happened. There was, well, if it happened, it would be fine. And that was basically an invitation for foreign adversaries to engage. Again, we've heard from Robert Mueller, one thing that he made very clear on Wednesday was that the efforts by Russia were meant to aid Trump, and he knows that.
So, Clint, I want to come back to you and end this block with you because you're the scariest guy at the table, and I feel as like we should be filled with foreboding and doom here. One of the things in the Senate Intel report is they say is, hey, as they were probing these vulnerabilities, maybe they were probing the vulnerabilities because they want to exploit them later, but maybe they would just want us to know that they're probing the vulnerabilities to get psyops, right? That the notion is that if you undermine people's confidence in the system, you've done really most of your work. You don't actually have to change votes or actually get in those systems. So I wonder, like, whether the reason I think it's relevant is that they did so many things that were easily detectable. They didn't cover their tracks. So when you look at it, do you think there's that what's so insidious about this is that they can either manipulate the election or manipulate our faith in the election? Either way, it's a win for Russia.
It is. It's a double-edged sword, and that's what's consistent throughout it. They take a very small action, even if we, as the U.S. government, come forward and mitigate it and announce, hey, we found an intrusion and we've patched it and we've taken care of it. When they've already, through that action, created some doubt. Well, how do you know? How didn't you fix it? It's 3 years now. We've been going through this for 3 years. I have no more confidence today than I did 3 years ago that we really have gotten to the bottom of it all and that we fixed all the patches. So when you look at that report yesterday, we don't go through with legislation, Honest Ads Act, election integrity. Yes, we report to the FBI when foreign actors hit us. That is a blueprint, in fact, for any actor, foreign or domestic, to completely mess up America for 3 more years after 2020.
Scale of 1 to 10, 10 being totally certain, 0 being totally uncertain, but 10 being totally certain. In 2020, that Russia or another hostile foreign state actor will actively interfere with the American election. What's your level of certainty on a scale of 1 to 10?
I think it depends on the Democratic candidates. That really will change it. And it comes down to Russia and Iran from afar. Yeah. I think the biggest fear I have is really domestic actors in 2020. Everyone is copying this. Disinformation proliferates. Right. You're seeing duplication of their methods, and you're seeing contractors for hire in a big, big way, foreign and domestic, that are trying to play in this game.
Well,
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.